Now, welcome back. President Cyril Ramaphosa will today respond to the debate on his opening of Parliament address in a joint sitting of the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces. Now, in his opening of Parliament address on Thursday evening, President Ramaphosa said that under the Government of National Unity, priority will be given to eliminate poverty, growing the economy to create jobs, and building a capable, ethical and developmental state. Now, the opposition benches criticised Ramaphosa, saying that he didn't bring anything new to the table. Now, to help us unpack those developments, also Friday's debate, we're joined here in studio now by political analyst from the Business School of the Northwest University, Dr. Piet Croucamp. Thanks so much for coming through. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thanks. Nice to be with you again.
So just going back to Thursday evening with the opening address by President Cyril Ramaphosa, and of course the subsequent debate on Friday, which kind of gave us a glimpse into what's to be expected during the 7th administration and how the House would possibly operate. What were your thoughts, your sentiments around that?
Look, you don't have to listen too carefully to notice there's a change in narrative with the President. I think he hasn't used the word comrade that often, and he used the word economic growth, I think 25 to 35 times. So I think there's ideological shift there, and one could say that is because that's the narrative of the Government of National Unity. It has changed. The President is not talking on behalf of the ANC only. He's talking on behalf of a new government. And I think that's important. And it started, when he announced that the ANC is accepting the results, and he announced the final results. Already there we saw the President say, let's shift the emphasis to the Constitution, to the greater good of all South Africans. Let's in somehow constitute the government that reflect the will of the people, and the will was that we only got 40% or 39.86%. So I think there's a change in the narrative of the President. The real question, I think that's what opposition benches ask. What has changed? Because he's been saying this for a long time. Even though the ideology is a little bit different, I would say. He's been saying this for a long time. Can this cabinet now execute the things that he's been talking about for 5 years already, or even longer?
And of course, we heard in the reaction post that opening address, the DA, for example, being very upbeat, as they should be, because I think quite a few of their sentiments expressed in their manifesto actually found expression in that opening address.
Exactly. I think John Steenhuisen said that there's not a lot of difference between what the President has said and what actually the DA has been pursuing as policies for a very long time. So I think there's a convergence. There is a degree of convergence. Of course, they will disagree about, I see Park Stow, the Minister of Trade and Industry, talking about black economic empowerment. There will be a dispute about that, the so-called Bella Act. And the President still has to sign that act. It's been past Parliament for a very long time. I don't know why the President is so hesitant on that. Maybe he wants to renegotiate parts of that, like he's already suggested as far as the National Health Policy and National Health Insurance Act is concerned, that he's quite willing to, before he signs other laws that has to support that particular law that has been signed on that day, that he will reconsider some inputs, involve more people before they make final decisions. So maybe the President is willing to negotiate some of the pillar policies of the ANC as well.
And where does that place him ultimately within the ANC and its alliance with the South African Communist Party and COSATU? Because how much leeway can he give comfortably before his own position within the ANC and the alliance becomes perhaps somewhat difficult or even untenable?
Look, in the past, presidents who picked up problems with the ANC in the past, like Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, the real pressure points didn't come from the COSATU, the labour unions. I think with Jacob Zuma, perhaps we could say the labour unions played a significant role. But there will be other fractures within the ANC which could lead to the removal of Ramaphosa. I don't see that yet anywhere. It looks like the Government of National Unity is buying to this, call it the new philosophy, or the way that the President expressed himself. To some extent, there's still a degree of collective convergence on issues like that. When you hear, for instance, Gwedi Mantashe, being Gwedi Mantashe, express opinions which one would think that it's rather the domain of the President to have an opinion on whether Helen Zille is a danger to cabinet. And when I think perhaps for Kilian Balula, says things from the Tuli House. One should see it in the context of the ANC that has the right to express opinions separately from the government of national unity. And the same thing goes for Alan Zill, and the same thing goes for some of the cabinet ministers of the DA now and part of the executive, that they are also in parliament. They're allowed to, and they should be allowed to express opinions contrary to the interests perhaps of the government of national unity even, because that's what competitive politics is about. And the whole idea, and I think that's what I like about Ramaphosa's new narrative, is there's a battle of ideas taking place in the cabinet now. In other words, it's not only the ANC pursuing a particular ideology. Now ministers have to defend their policies, explain their ideas, and I think that's good. That's really, really good for governance.
Speaking of, do you think that this will necessarily result in heightened accountability and greater oversight in Parliament?
Look, in Parliament it's a different thing. Remember in the past, the opposition was what you could call, so the DA was a liberal democratic political party. They support the constitution. They acted within the architecture of Parliament to a significant degree. Now you have the MK party who think that the constitution should be torn up. You have the EFF who from time to time question important parts of the constitution. So what type of accountability do they talk about when they talk about the extent to which they will hold the executive accountable? It's a very, very different opposition that we have now, because the DA and the parties like Ramzanzi were now part of the government of national unity. It's going to be difficult for them to play the role of holding the executive accountable like they've done in the past. They still have to find their feet in that particular space. And now the primary opposition, the head of the opposition in the Parliament, is a political party that do not subscribe to the values and the principles of our constitution. So accountability is being defined quite differently now. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
That's a very interesting point, because should it be? Does it mean that if parties have signed on to, our signatories to that statement of intent of the Government of National Unity, does that then preclude them from playing an oversight role in Parliament, an effective oversight role in Parliament?
One would hope not. If you have the clash of ideologies in Parliament, that's not the battle of ideas. And one would think now these parties who've signed this statement of intent will, when they involve themselves in the debate in Parliament, in the committees, it will be about ideas, exchange of ideas, the need to make some compromises. The DA can't come and say, well, this is our policy and this particular law is contrary to our policies and we will oppose it at all costs. They will have to accept, even in Parliament, in the committees, that this might not be what we wanted, but it's willing to reach a compromise for the greater good, for the sustainability of the government of national unity. And I think that's actually much, much better. As opposed to what we had in Parliament. We just had a clash of ideologies in the committees, in Parliament, and you never really know which one of these ideas that's been proposed are really the best idea or the best policy for South Africa and which serves South Africans much better. I think we've shifted away from the complex battle between ideology, perhaps to the battle between ideas. I hope so. I really, really hope so, because it'll make accountability and it'll make good governance just more feasible.
And you know, beyond the policy framework, just looking at accountability as it pertains to governance, if you take Phala, for example, and we know what the DA stance was in the 6th Parliament, and coming into the 7th Parliament, now that they are part of the Government of National Unity, in terms of accountability, you know, if they do oppose or don't oppose, should we be reading anything into what they proceed to do from here on in?
Yeah, I think they must all now be grown-ups and realize that the sustainability of the government of national unity is of critical importance. There's no evidence, lots of suggestions, insinuations, there's no evidence that the president has done anything contrary to the laws of South Africa. You can move on now for the sake of the government of national unity. It doesn't mean that they shouldn't be asking the good questions. It doesn't mean if new evidence comes to the fore that they shouldn't ask the president good questions again. But it simply means that you cannot now sustainable keep on hammering on about something in a way that undermines the cohesiveness of the government of national unity or even the executive. There are things that are just more important. There are priorities. You have to be pragmatic now. And I think opposition parties like the DA will have to be pragmatic. And they've been when they said they will not support a motion of no confidence in the president when it comes to Pala. It's being pragmatic, and that's important.
What about the fact that the president didn't address the foreign policy issue as pointedly as perhaps he would have done or previous presidents would have done in years gone by?
Yeah, well, I think the question about Ramaphosa and foreign policy is important rather than the historical context that you want to put it in. On Russia, the president and the ANC has moved. They're not exactly the same way they've been. I think after they went with the African delegation to Moscow, when the president came back, he was a different man. The questions he asked Vladimir Putin was much more pointed, critical than we would assume he will have asked when he left here. I think already there was a shift in terms of their Russian policy. In terms of Israel, you can't have a different policy. You can't change now. I think it's honestly, we have the moral high ground, we've done the right thing. And I think all parties, the DA must accept that international law and the international community has accepted South Africa's stance as the legitimate stance. And just this past week, there was another confirmation of the illegitimate occupation of certain territories in Israel. So I don't think there can be a question about big differences there. But yes, it's a good question. About ANC's foreign policy, especially because they seem to side with Venezuela, they seem to side with Cuba, they seem to side with so-called rogue states in the world. But even that, I think, has been toned down significantly, and maybe they tone it down by making less of a concern and the issue of foreign policy play down. So it's important, but we're not going to make that the basis on which the government of national unity rests or stand or fall.
And also the terminology is important in terms of determining who are rogue states. You know, who's to decide on that? Rogue by whose definition?
No, it's simple. If you're not a democracy, China's not a democracy, Cuba's not a democracy, Venezuela's not a democracy.
But does that make China a rogue state?
Well, a rogue in a sense that in terms of international law and justice, if you pursue the ideals of fairness, of justice, of democracy, of freedom, then you've the norm. That's the norm. That's the international norm. We shouldn't be protecting states who deliberately undermine those principles which we in the international community think is good by using euphemisms for societies and states and dictators that do not conform to that. Xi Jinping is a dictator. He's a Communist Party. You cannot have a former labor union. You cannot have a student organization. There's no freedom there. Don't call him anything, but in terms of these values in the international community, a rogue state. South Africa is not a rogue state, and if we wish for the people of China the same rights that we wish for ourselves, we will call them rogues.
So there are democracies, so-called democracies, where also human rights abuses take place.
They're not a democracy. China's not a democracy. Why did you try
I'm not talking about
there?
China. I'm saying there are democracies in this world where human rights abuses take place on a daily basis.
And we should call them out. They are, and America is one of those. The foreign policy can be inhumane. They also transgress the rules of international justice and fairness, and they should be called out. But everybody should be called out.
Dr. Piet Croucamp, unfortunately we're out of time, but of course talking to us about what has happened in Parliament so far. We had that joint sitting on Friday, President Cyril Ramaphosa delivering the opening address for the 7th Parliament, and of course talking to what happened subsequently. Dr. Piet Croucamp, political analyst from the Business School of the Northwest University.